October of 1878 arrived early in Windbreak Fork, Wyoming Territory. Cold came down from the high country before the first snow ever touched the valley floor, and every family understood the same hard truth. If the cabins weren't sealed before winter arrived, winter would finish the job for them. Amidst the ring of axes and the groan of wagons heavy with timber, one man defied them all, Owen McCrae. The 40-year-old stonemason did not cut timber. Day after day, he hauled heavy bluestone blocks toward a barren rise, building a structure that looked all wrong, thick, round, and windowless. It resembled an abandoned grain silo more than a home. It's good stone. I built with 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 good. Others shaking their heads. Stone pulls heat, they warned. Stone sweats. It freezes a man from the inside out. Their concern deepened when they saw the flimsy canvas tent beside it, where his pregnant wife Eliza lived. They whispered that the mason wasn't building a shelter, he was building a grave. But what they didn't yet understand was that Owen McCrae was not trying to fight winter the way they were. He was preparing to outlast it, because winter on the frontier did not negotiate, it only measured. So if you enjoy forgotten frontier engineering, real survival wisdom, and stories where nature becomes the final judge, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay through the end. Because the measurements taken inside that stone tower would eventually silence an entire Wyoming settlement. Long before Owen McCrae ever saw the plains of Wyoming Territory, he had lived near the Orkney coast in the northern highlands of Scotland, where winter wind came hard off the sea and stayed for months. For more than 20 years, he worked as a stonemason in places where cold was treated like a living thing. Something patient, something that waited for weak walls and careless builders. He built thick-walled byre houses where livestock heat helped families survive the night. He dug underground root cellars beneath frozen hillsides. He laid masonry hearths so heavy they continued radiating warmth long after midnight. He repaired storm shelters hammered year after year by freezing Atlantic wind. And he had seen the cost of failure. He had seen cabins burned through entire wood piles before February, seen frost growing across bedroom walls before dawn, seen families freezing quietly beside dying fires because the heat vanished faster than they could create it. But Owen had also seen something else. Stone houses that stayed warm until morning with only a small evening fire. When he arrived in Windbreak Fork, he looked at the settlers' log cabins and recognized the same mistake immediately. They were burning wood to heat air, not to store heat, and in a brutal winter, air lost the fight first. Most families in Windbreak Fork built the same kind of cabin, straight lodgepole pine, mud packed between the logs, dried moss stuffed into gaps, a cast iron stove near one wall, fast to raise, familiar, proven enough to trust. At first glance, Owen understood why settlers depended on them. Timber was everywhere, stone was not. But the longer he studied those cabins, the more problems he saw. Fresh-cut logs shrank as they dried. Mud cracked, moss loosened. Tiny openings appeared where wall met roof or floor met foundation, and Wyoming wind had a way of finding openings no human eye could see. At night, the cabin spoke constantly. Wood creaked. Walls snapped softly in the cold. Drafts moved through sleeping rooms like invisible streams of river water. The settlers blamed winter temperatures for their suffering. Owen blamed heat loss, because the true frontier calculation was never simply how cold the season became. The real question was always how fast a family burned through its wood pile before spring arrived. As long as wood remained, a family still had a chance. Once the pile disappeared, winter took control. No one understood that truth better than Amos Bell, a father of 4 living near the creek bed east of town. Nearly every evening, Amos stood outside after dark splitting more timber beneath lantern light, while blood opened across the skin of his hands. And still his cabin barely stayed above freezing before dawn. Near the end of September, the settlement gathered inside the trading hall to discuss winter preparations, timber routes, and shared livestock shelters before the mountain passes closed. That was when Owen McCrae explained what he intended to build. Not a cabin, not a sod house, a round stone tower with walls nearly 30 in thick, A low central hearth, heat channels buried beneath the floor in a horseshoe pattern to spread warmth through the structure itself instead of losing it through open air. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the laughter started. A few men chuckled quietly. Others leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads. One trapper muttered that the Scotsman was building a grain silo instead of a home, but the strongest reaction came from Silas Brenner, the settlement's best carpenter, a broad-shouldered builder who had spent most of his adult life raising timber cabins across Nebraska and Wyoming. Silas did not laugh at first. He looked genuinely alarmed. "Stone pulls heat from flesh," he said flatly. "Everybody knows that. Stone sweats. Stone traps damp, and damp kills faster than cold." Then his eyes shifted toward Eliza McCrae, standing quietly near the back wall with one hand resting against her pregnant stomach. "And if your fire dies one night," Silas asked, "what happens to her inside that stone tower?" The room fell silent again. Owen never argued. He simply nodded once, stepped outside into the cold evening wind, and returned to hauling stone. By the second week of October, most cabins in Windbreak Fork already had roofs. Smoke rose steadily from fresh stove pipes each morning. Men had moved on to stacking winter wood and reinforcing barn doors against drifting snow. Owen McCrae was still digging. The frost line had already started hardening the ground, and every inch fought back against the shovel. He cut downward nearly 4 ft through stiff earth and broken shale before laying the first layer of crushed stone into the trench. After that came drainage gravel, then clay-lime mortar, then more stone. The work looked painfully slow compared to timber framing. Settlers passing the ridge often stopped long enough to make jokes before continuing on their way. Building a smoke tower, McCrae. Others called it a grain tomb. One ranch hand laughed and described the structure as a stone chimney without a house attached to it. Owen ignored all of them because he understood something the others did not. If moisture remained trapped beneath the tower, frozen ground would pull heat downward all winter long. Stone alone would not save the structure. Drainage mattered first. Dry ground mattered first. Without that, the cold would slowly bleed warmth from the floor no matter how large the fire became. So he kept building carefully, slowly, methodically. Winter punished rushed foundations. And out on the exposed ridge, Eliza worked beside him beneath the hard Wyoming wind, mixing mortar with gloved hands while carrying a child that would be born before spring. By early November, the shape of Owen McCrae's structure had become impossible to ignore. The tower stood thick and round against the gray Wyoming sky, rising slowly above the ridge west of Windbreak Fork. Its walls were massive. Its windows were few and narrow. From a distance, the thing looked less like a frontier home and more like a forgotten grain silo, abandoned by some failed settlement years earlier. People began riding out of their way just to look at it. That only made Silas Brenner more irritated. The carpenter explained the same argument over and over beside wood piles, wagon trails, and the trading post stove. "Stone conducts cold," he warned. "Touch frozen rock long enough and it steals heat straight from your body. A log wall insulates. Stone does not." Then he pointed toward the ridge. "That tower will burn twice the wood by January." To most settlers, the argument sounded reasonable because part of it was true. Cold stone did pull warmth from bare skin faster than timber. Everyone who had ever sat on frozen rock understood that feeling immediately. But Owen kept building anyway. The outer wall rose from fitted bluestone blocks shaped carefully by hammer and chisel. The center core was packed with smaller fieldstone and dense mortar. Inside, the interior surface was smooth, flatter than most frontier masonry, so radiant heat could spread evenly across the curved walls, instead of collecting in isolated hot spots. Slowly, the structure stopped looking random. It started looking intentional. One afternoon, a small boy standing beside a wagon asked his mother the question nobody else wanted to say out loud. Why would anyone sleep inside a grain tower? What truly separated Owen McCrae's tower from every other structure in Windbreak Fork was not the stone wall. It was the floor beneath it. Most frontier cabins placed a stove near one wall and pushed heat outward into open air. Owen did the opposite. He lowered the hearth itself close to the center of the tower, almost like a shallow fire pit built into the structure rather than added afterward. Then he dug a curved trench system beneath the floor. The channels bent outward in a broad horseshoe shape before turning north toward the chimney exit. Hot smoke and trapped air would travel through those buried passages first, heating the stone underneath the room before escaping outside. The concept looked strange even to experienced builders. Around the hearth, Owen packed dense ironstone cobbles gathered from dry creek beds west of the valley. Along the western wall, he built a low stone bench wide enough for sleeping beneath blankets during the coldest part of winter. The floor itself was covered with fitted shale slabs because shale absorbed radiant heat steadily without releasing it too fast all at once. To most settlers, the entire system appeared absurd. They saw a fire hole in the middle of the room, a few trenches beneath the floor, and far too much stone. Silas Brenner shook his head the first time he inspected the unfinished interior. "You're building an oven," he muttered. But Owen was building something else entirely, a structure designed to store heat instead of chasing it. Late one evening, after the first small test fire burned down into glowing coals, Eliza stepped carefully across the shale floor and rested her hand against the stone near the sleeping bench. Several minutes passed. The warmth remained. It did not disappear the way heat vanished from timber walls or cabin air. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming Territory, she began to understand what Owen had been trying to build all along. The first serious problem arrived with the wind. Not snow, not cold wind. Near the middle of November, a hard northern gust rolled down through the valley after dark and struck the ridge broadside. The air outside screamed across the tower walls hard enough to rattle the unfinished chimney cap. Then the smoke turned. Instead of climbing upward, it pushed backward through the flue trench and spilled directly into the room. Within seconds, the tower filled with thick, bitter smoke. Hot ash swirled across the shale floor. Eliza woke coughing violently beneath the blankets while the fire pit spat sparks against the stone ring. Owen killed the draft opening immediately and dragged the door wide open. Freezing air rushed inside. Smoke poured out into the Wyoming darkness. For several minutes, Eliza stood outside bent forward beneath a wool blanket trying to breathe clean air while the cold cut across the ridge. Her eyes watered from smoke. The wind snapped the canvas tarp beside the tower like rifle fire. Inside, Owen studied the hearth in silence. By lantern light, he finally understood the mistake. Music. The chimney was too short for the ridge wind. Worse than that, the curved tower walls were creating rotating air currents that shoved smoke downward instead of allowing a stable draw upward. He did not defend the design. He did not blame the weather. He worked. Through most of the night, Owen rebuilt the upper chimney section stone by stone. He changed the vent angle, added a rough stone baffle near the flue entrance to slow the reverse pressure. Then he tested the draw again and again while snow flurries drifted sideways across the ridge. By dawn, soot covered his hands, his coat, and half the tower floor, but the smoke finally climbed upward the way it was supposed to. And for the first time, the settlement would have seen something important if they had been there to witness it. Owen McCrae was not winning because he never failed. He was winning because he corrected mistakes before winter could exploit them. A week later, winter found another weakness. An early freeze locked the ridge solid for nearly 2 days. Then warmer air rolled briefly through the valley and softened the ground just enough for trapped moisture to shift beneath the tower foundation. Owen Clear's throat noticed the problem at sunrise. Thin beads of condensation had formed beneath several shale slabs near the hearth trench. Worse still, a narrow hairline crack had appeared in one section of mortar along the western floor. The flaw was small, but small flaws became deadly in Wyoming winters. News traveled quickly through Windbreak Fork, and before long, Silas Brenner was repeating the same warning beside the trading post stove. "Stone sweats," he told anyone willing to listen. "Then stone kills." For the first time since construction began, even some settlers who had defended Owen started doubting the tower openly. Eliza heard the whispers, too. That night, while wind pushed cold dust against the outer wall, She sat quietly beside the hearth with both hands resting against her stomach and watched Owen inspect the cracked mortar again and again by lantern light. He did not dismiss the damage. He tore part of the floor apart the very next morning. Several shale slabs came up. Sections of drainage stone were replaced entirely. Owen widened airflow gaps beneath part of the floor and increased the distance between the heated trench system and the western sleeping bench to prevent trapped moisture from condensing too close to the warm surface stone. The work cost him 3 full days. 3 cold days. 3 days with snow clouds gathering deeper over the mountains, because Owen understood something most settlers still did not. Heat alone solved nothing. Without controlled airflow and dry foundations, warmth could become a trap instead of protection. Late on the 3rd evening, Owen sat alone beside the unfinished floor with cold mortar covering his hands. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming Territory, doubt finally reached him. Not doubt about the tower. Doubt about whether his mistakes might place Eliza and the unborn child in danger before winter was finished testing them both. By the final week of November, Owen McCrae's tower was finished. The structure stood alone against the ridge like something older than the settlement itself. Its only true entrance faced south to reduce exposure to prevailing winter wind. Narrow eastern windows admitted weak morning light without sacrificing too much heat. Inside, the western stone bench curved along the wall beneath heavy wool blankets, while the central hearth radiated steady warmth outward through the floor beneath it. Above everything rested a low, sod-covered roof built to resist hard crosswinds instead of impressing neighbors. From a distance, the tower still looked wrong. Some days it resembled a grain silo, other days a watchtower. In heavy fog, it looked almost like an abandoned smokehouse left behind by another generation entirely. Settlers continued riding up the ridge simply to inspect it before shaking their heads and leaving again. Silas Brenner remained the loudest critic. By January, he warned one evening beside the trading hall stove, "That tower will either freeze them solid or cook them alive. Stone doesn't forgive mistakes." But Owen said very little now. The repairs had changed him. He no clears throat, longer worked with the confidence of theory. He worked with the caution of a man who understood how close failure could stand beside success in frontier country. Each afternoon, he quietly stacked dry fir and cedar beneath a small lean-to on the southern side of the tower. The wood pile looked strangely small for winter. That detail unsettled people more than the tower itself. Then the first true snowfall began, light and silent, blanketing the entire ridge in white. The time for building was over. Now the judgment had begun. By Christmas, winter had tightened its grip around Windbreak Fork. Temperatures dropped below 5 degrees zero, and the wood piles that had looked enormous in October now appeared alarmingly small by lantern light. Life inside the log cabins had become a relentless battle. Each night, families were forced to wake again and again to feed their starving stoves, trying to beat back a bone-deep cold that could never fully be banished. Frost spread like a white sickness across the interior walls where warm breath met cold timber, and water left in buckets was frozen solid by morning. Meanwhile, the tower on the ridge remained strangely quiet, almost defiant. Owen McCrae kept only a modest fire burning in the central hearth. There were no roaring flames, no desperate all-night feeding of wood. The stone walls patiently absorbed the heat, held it, and then slowly radiated it back into the space. For the first time in months, Eliza McCrae slept through an entire winter night without waking to save the fire. Near midnight, she opened her eyes briefly to see only a bed of red coals. Yet the room was still steady, secure, and warm. But winter's assault had only just begun. January arrived and turned the cold from harsh to merciless. A northern front descended like an iron sheet, plunging temperatures toward 40 below zero. Wind tore through the mountain gaps, shrieking like a predator and shaking cabin walls through the night. Everything became brittle and broke. The struggle in Windbreak Fork's cabins became a desperate battle for survival. No one felt it more than the Bells. Their stove now burned almost constantly, devouring log after log. Yet the floor remained painfully cold, and the frost continued its advance. The ring of an axe echoed through the settlement long after midnight as men with numb hands were forced outside to split more timber under the flickering light of a lantern. Even Silas Brenner, in his better-built cabin, felt doubt creep in as his wood pile shrank with frightening speed. The log cabins were bleeding heat into the uncaring darkness. The final breaking point came one night inside the Bell family cabin. Martha leaned over her sleeping son to pull the blanket higher and suddenly froze. A thin layer of ice had formed along the edge of the wool where the boy's breath had settled during the night. She turned away from the stove and quietly began to cry. During the worst stretch of the cold wave, trapper and mule handler, Jonah Pike rode west of the settlement to inspect his frozen trap line near the ridge trails. The temperature was deadly even by Wyoming standards. Snow squealed beneath the mule's hooves. Every breath burned the lungs going in. The wind carried almost no loose powder anymore because the cold had frozen the surface crust solid. That was when Jonah noticed the chimney above Owen McCrae's tower. The smoke was wrong. Every cabin in Windbreak Fork was pushing thick black columns into the sky by then. Fires had to burn constantly just to keep people alive. But Owen's chimney released only a thin gray thread drifting quietly into the wind. Jonah slowed the mule immediately. His first thought was simple. The fire must have died. And if the fire died in weather like this, the people inside usually died soon after. He dismounted near the ridge and walked toward the tower through knee-deep snow, expecting silence, frost, maybe worse. Instead, he noticed something impossible. The stone wall carried warmth, not blazing heat, not furnace heat, a slow, steady warmth radiating through the bluestone itself. Jonah pressed his gloved hand harder against the tower, then quickly pulled it back again as if the rock had shocked him. Because at 40 degrees below zero, warm stone should not have existed at all. A moment later, the heavy south-facing door opened. Owen McCrae stood in the entrance wearing only wool trousers, thick socks, and a plain gray sweater. No heavy coat, no frost gathered in his beard, no sign of panic, only calm. Warm air drifted slowly out of the tower behind him. Jonah stepped inside carefully, still expecting to find some hidden roaring furnace consuming impossible amounts of wood. There was none. The central hearth held only a bed of glowing red coals beneath a few modest flames licking around split-fir logs. The fire was small, almost disappointingly small for weather this brutal. Yet the room felt steady and alive with warmth. Not sharp heat close to the fire and cold everywhere else like most cabins. This warmth spread evenly through the tower itself. The shale floor carried heat upward through Jonah's boots. The curved stone walls no longer felt cold or damp. Even the air moved differently. Softer, slower, without the biting edge that usually existed inside frontier cabins during deep winter. Along the western wall, Eliza McCrae slept soundly beneath heavy wool blankets on the stone bench Owen had built months earlier. One hand rested lightly across the curve of her pregnant stomach. She never stirred. Jonah stared at the glowing coals again, then at the walls, then at the sleeping woman. Outside, people were waking every few hours to feed starving stoves before their homes froze solid. Inside this strange stone tower, no one had needed to rise in the middle of the night at all. And suddenly, the structure on the ridge no longer looked foolish to him. It looked dangerous. Dangerous to every assumption the settlement had trusted about surviving winter. By the following afternoon, the story had spread through all of Windbreak Fork. Men left wood piles half-finished just to ride toward the ridge. Women bundled children into coats and stood outside cabins staring at the strange tower through blowing snow. Nobody trusted rumors in weather like this. Not unless measurements proved them true. That was why Captain Elias Rowe came personally. Before settling in Wyoming Territory, Elias had served as a military quartermaster responsible for fuel, supply counts, and winter survival logistics. He trusted numbers more than opinions. When he arrived at the tower, he carried a mercury thermometer, a weather notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and enough practical experience to recognize exaggeration when he heard it. Owen simply opened the door and stepped aside. Steam drifted from the gathered settlers as they entered one at a time from the brutal cold outside. Elias waited several minutes before recording the first measurement. Nearly 68 degrees inside, below 40 outside. The difference stunned him enough to repeat the reading twice. Then he inspected the rest of the settlement. Amos Bell's cabin struggled near the lower 40s despite constant fire. Sela's Brenner's performed better but still barely held above 50 with heavy wood consumption. Jonah's trapper's shelter was colder still. When Elias returned to the ridge near dusk, the crowd had grown silent. Even Silas said nothing as he placed his bare hand against the warm inner stone wall, the same wall he had once called deadly. Elias finally opened his notebook beneath lantern light. Owen McCrae burned roughly 20 lb of wood in the last 18 hours, he announced. Amos Bell burned over 80. Sela's Brenner nearly 65. The tower remained between 9 and 12 degrees warmer than every cabin tested using less than 1/4 of the fuel. No one laughed anymore. Not after the measurements. Not after the cold itself had delivered its judgment. Most men in Windbreak Fork believed the argument had already been settled. Captain Elias Rowe did not. Late that evening, while snow drifted across the ridge outside the tower, Elias proposed one final test. Let the fire die completely. No fresh wood. No hidden fuel. No feeding the hearth through the night. If the tower truly stored heat the way Owen claimed, the structure itself would prove it before morning. Owen agreed immediately. Just after sunset, the final split logs burned down into red coals. Then the hearth was left untouched. Elias recorded the interior temperature carefully before closing his notebook and settling into wait. Hour after hour, the Wyoming cold pressed harder against the outer walls. Inside ordinary cabins, fires would have needed constant feeding by then. Temperatures would already be collapsing toward freezing. But inside the stone tower, the change came slowly, almost strangely slowly. The western stone bench remained warm enough for sleeping. The shale floor still carried gentle heat upward through heavy socks and blankets. Even after midnight, the curved bluestone walls continued releasing stored warmth back into the room little by little, as though the structure itself were breathing heat into the darkness. Outside, the wind never stopped. Inside, the tower refused to surrender quickly. By dawn, more than 11 hours after the fire had fully died, the hearth contained only gray ash and dull black coals. As the light spread across the valley, Captain Rowe stepped forward. He didn't need to consult his notebook. He checked the mercury thermometer one final time, then turned back toward the group, his face carrying a mixture of disbelief and deep respect. 38 degrees, he said, his voice quiet but clear in the silence, still safely above freezing. No one spoke after that. There was no need. The argument had not been settled by words, but by stone, time, and the unforgiving truth of temperature. The tower had not merely survived the test, it had won. The next morning, the storm finally weakened. Thin gray light spread across Windbreak Fork, while smoke climbed heavily from exhausted cabins below the ridge. Men moved slowly through snowdrifts toward shrinking wood piles. Axes started again before sunrise. Then Sela's Brenner climbed the hill alone. No crowd followed him this time, no laughter, no arguments. He stopped outside the tower door for several seconds before finally knocking once against the thick timber frame. Owen opened the door quietly. For a moment, neither man spoke. The carpenter's face looked older than it had only a week earlier. Exhaustion showed in his eyes, so did something else, relief. "I was wrong," Silas said at last, not angry, not bitter, simply honest. He glanced once toward the warm stone walls inside the tower before continuing. "I kept thinking like a carpenter," he admitted. "I thought the fire made the heat, but the tower keeps it." Owen said nothing. Silas lowered his voice slightly. "Can you teach me how to do this with a cabin?" That was the moment the real victory finally arrived. Not because Owen had won an argument. Winter had done that for him. And standing there in the doorway of the stone tower, Owen McCrae never repeated a single insult or warning that had once been thrown at him. He simply stepped aside and invited Silas inside. By the spring of 1879, the settlement had already begun changing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The way practical knowledge usually spreads across frontier country. Silas Brenner was the first to adapt his own cabin. He rebuilt the area around his stove using layered stone and dense mortar so the structure could absorb heat instead of wasting it through open air. The improvement was immediate. The fire no longer needed constant feeding through the night. Amos Bell added a thick thermal wall along the north side of his cabin before the next winter arrived. Jonah Pike began carrying heated stones wrapped in canvas during long trap-line trips through the mountains, allowing him to keep warmth inside bedding shelters long after campfires burned low. Even settlers who still distrusted the tower itself started copying pieces of Owen's ideas. More stone around hearths, better drainage beneath foundations, smaller but steadier fires, and slowly wood piles stopped disappearing so quickly. By the following winter, several families in Windbreak Fork were using nearly 1/3 less firewood than before. The strange structure on the ridge no longer looked foolish then. It looked valuable. Travelers passing through nearby valleys started hearing stories about the round stone tower that had survived the brutal Wyoming cold using almost no wood at all. Some dismissed the story. Others rode out to see it themselves. Eventually, the technique spreading from cabin to cabin gained a nickname among settlers and freight crews moving through the territory. They called it the McCrae Tower Method, and for the first time in many months, Amos Bell slept through an entire winter night without waking once to split wood in the dark. Owen McCrae's tower remained standing for decades above Windbreak Fork. It outlived most of the settlement's original cabins. Roofs collapsed, timber walls warped and rotted, entire structures disappeared into prairie weather and hard Wyoming winters. The stone tower remained. Years later, when a new freight road finally cut across the ridge, the old structure had to be dismantled to clear the route. But even then, the tower was not destroyed by cold weakness or failure. Time simply asked the land for something different. The bluestone blocks were carried down into town and reused to build a large community hearth inside the settlement church. An older Silas Brenner helped place many of those stones himself. One afternoon, while fitting mortar between the final pieces, he rested his hand against the warm masonry and quietly said, "He built it to survive. Turns out it taught the rest of us how." Owen McCrae never truly invented thermal mass heating. Long before Wyoming Territory existed, other civilizations had already learned similar lessons. Russian masonry stoves, Korean ondal floors, Roman hypocaust systems, adobe homes across the American Southwest. Again and again, people facing brutal winters discovered the same truth. Heat that is stored survives longer than heat that is chased, and nature does not care where wisdom comes from. It only tests whether it works. That was the real lesson waiting inside the stone tower on the ridge above Windbreak Fork. Not pride, not invention, not even victory. Only respect for knowledge proven under pressure. Because the winter never cared who sounded confident. It only cared who stayed warm. And before you go, leave a comment below. What old survival knowledge do you think the modern world abandoned too quickly?